Hello and welcome to another video. We are going to talk about flex layout again. And this one is requested by the community. So someone came up with this example, and this is a right menu. So a lot of times in your app, you're going to have a right context menu. Maybe you have to hold down OK, and you want this menu to come from the right side. And I want to go through how this person started to implement this and give some suggestions, ideas, feedback, and help to understand, what is Flex doing and why it's not exactly what you would expect coming from the web development environment and world. And like I've said before, is I've been a web developer for a long, long time. And in fact, I've been a Lightning developer for the last 3 or 4 years now, and I've reached a point where like I understand CSS a little bit, but I'm starting to forget some of the nuances. So I'm going to go through, how this is working with Lightning, and help understand this example. So, and again, I think what I'll do is I'll have these open like this so we can kind of see it on the screen as well, and see the code behind it. So I'll just have it like this. So here we have a flex with a flex end. This is the yellow container. So this is the yellow container. And then this is the column inside the yellow container with the boxes with text elements. So we can get an idea for the structure of this already. Now, the first thing, the most important thing with Solid and Lightning is if you don't specify a width, so there's no width or height on this view element, what happens is when the node is created, so when Solid creates this node, what it's doing is saying, oh, you didn't specify a width? That's cool. I'm going to give you the default, which is whatever your parent heights and width is, which is usually 1920 by 1080. So here, the framework is adding width and height of 1920 by 1080. And we can see that by just clicking on this node. So we can inspect and just be like, see this node here? This is that container. And the width and height of this is 1920 by 1080. So you'll just have to take my word because that's probably small in the video, but it's 1920 by 1080. And then our column inside there is 400 by 1080. So again, anytime we don't specify the width or the height, it takes on the parent's width or height. And the difference between HTML is, so if the parent height or width changed, the child element would then adjust its size to be contained inside that box. That does not happen with this. Once the height or width is set or calculated, it doesn't update based on the size of its parent changing or anything like that. You get a fixed height and width at creation unless you change it. So that's one important aspect. Now here, I want to emphasize, like, you also want to try to avoid flex whenever it's not important or critical or necessary. So this first case, we have the entire window screen, and we're using flex end because we want to set this to the right side of the screen. So an alternative way of doing this, there's a couple ways of doing it. So we're going to save, and you're going to see this bounces back to the left because it's no longer inside of a flex container. So in order to do that, we could set the X position of this, and we know the screen is 1920, and we can subtract the width of this of 400, and now that's going to put the X position over to the right side of the screen. Now, alternatively, the other simple way of doing that, there's a shortcut, which is right, and right does the same thing. It says, rather than using X, which sets the location of this based on the left side of the screen, we're using right, which says offset it by 0 on the right. So it starts from the right. We can do 100 pixels off from the right, etc. So here we got rid of one flex calculation just by using right shortcut. And again, like the cool part about this is everything in Lightning is position absolute. So just think of, I have divs, they're position absolute, which makes setting up where things should be on the screen a lot simpler than if you were using HTML, because as long as they're top level nodes, you can just put them anywhere you want on the screen just by changing their X, Y position or right position. Okay, so those were the important things. Is this thing has a width, so the width of this is going to be 400, and the height of this is going to be 1080. Now, this is a flex container, and it's doing two calculations, or it's telling its children to do two calculations. So we have, these are part of the flex container is we're setting up in a column position and being in the center of the screen. And then whenever you use align items, what that does is it tells the flex that you also need to update the X or Y position. So this is updating the X and the Y value of every child element underneath here. So again, like with align items, this is not critical because if we get rid of align items, we know the width of this is 400. We know the width of this is 300. If we want to center this, all we have to do is say X equals 50, and then it's centered. Like again, it's another flex calculation that's probably not needed. You can just easily put X equals 50. And again, like the reason we want to reduce these calculations is we are on a low end box, and these little tweaks actually can make a big difference depending on the number of nodes that you have going on the screen. So you definitely want to avoid flex in simple cases where you have 100 elements and every one of them has like a flex to just put one thing of text on there. It's like, no, just set the XY position. All right, so let's continue this. So another piece of confusion is this margin top. And why can't I just set the Y value equal to 100 and not use margin top? And the reason for that is, again, what this does, what this top level flex is doing is it's overriding what the Y value is. So when you're using flex, it's saying, I'm going to take care of setting the Y value. So regardless of what you set this as, it's actually going to override the value of it, which is very interesting because it seems to be moving stuff around. So I'm going to have to play with that. Let me play with that and then continue the video and figure out why it's doing that. Okay, so continuing on, I remember now why this is happening and what it's doing. So when you have no height specified and you specify a Y position, the other thing that Solid is doing is saying, hey, I know the height of this is 1080. I want to set the height of this to 1080, but since you set a Y position, what it's doing is it's setting the height of this element equal to the Y position, so 1080 minus the Y position, so 600. So it's making the height of this container smaller because you've moved it inside of its parent container. So I thought this was a nice thing to happen. This is what it's doing because this is how I designed it, because I wanted elements like if you move the X position, it stays within the parent container by just taking up less width or less height because it's taking into effect its parent size. So it's doing this calculation for you. So when you set the Y property, the weird part is it's going to update the height of this to be a different height. So it's going to make the height of this 480. And then the Y position is going to be recalculated. So this kind of goes away because the flex container is taking over and changing it. So that could lead to a little bit of weirdness if you don't understand what that's doing. And like one way to fix that is specify the height on here that you want. So you could just say height equals 1080 and that would fix it, right? This is because of the default height being set. The Y position kind of affects the X and Y position affects the default height and width of the element when you create it. Okay. And also like the Y position is overridden, afterwards by flex. And just to restate this, the height and width is set when the node is created, and then flex happens. So flex happens after all the nodes are created and their width and height is assigned. That's when the flex calculations kick in and then change the X, Y position because it needs to know all that information in order to do layout. All right, so let's continue on. And that's why if you set the Y value, it's going to change the height unless you set the height of what you want it to be. And so now that's going to have no difference. Now, margin top is an alternative or the way that you would want to move this around inside of a flex container. So margin top of 50, what that's doing is it's saying when you calculate out the Y position of this first element, increase that Y position by 50. So that's what margin does. It's same as margin left, margin right. It's changing whatever calculation is when it's going across to change the offset of it in the flex calculations. Okay. And the other thing is, at any time you can go through and see the flex calculations, which I'm trying to change to the other Visual Studio Code that I have open. I thought I had another Visual Studio Code open. Here it is. It's down here. But this is the flex calculations. It's part of the core library. And you can go through and see all the calculations. They get a little bit like it's a lot to like read through this code because it's pretty performant. It checks the justification that you have on the element to do layout, and each one has a different layout depending on whether you want it flex start, which is the default, end, center, etc. But at any time, what I like to do is if you're questioning what's happening in the flex calculations, go to sources, Command P, and you can open up flex from Lightning Core. You can set breakpoints in here. You can set log statements to be like, hey, what are you doing? And you can actually, hover over the start and the next size and where things are being positioned. Feel free to open a bug or an issue if you want it to work differently. Like, I'm open for ideas and suggestions on this. This is just how it currently works. So let's continue through the example and we'll see what else we can do to make this better. So I thought this was interesting, this usage of flex grow here. So we'll go through that. Let's see, now I'll minimize this again so we can see the screen. So what flex grow is doing is we have this box on the top and we want two boxes down the bottom. And we're using one element in the center to kind of take up all that other available space, which I thought was a pretty neat idea because then you can have multiple elements here and then you can have flex grow to kind of move these elements down to the bottom. But one of the issues is you want that margin top. So what you probably want rather than what you're doing is you want this box to have margin top of 50. And that will take this top box and move it down 50 pixels off the top, which we got to check why is it not 50 pixels off of the top. So yeah, that's because we're not setting the props here. Let's change this so that we can pass props into our box and we can spread our props. And so now this is doing what we want, is we want the top element to be 50 pixels off the top. We don't want that on necessarily the column. We want it on this first box. And the same thing with this box at the bottom. Let me check if we can do margin bottom. I don't know if this will work, but well, yeah, now it's perfect. So now we're moving it up off the bottom, which is kind of what we want because it's taking into the calculations at the bottom. So this is one way of doing it, is using this flex grow. And there's another way of doing it, which I'm going to ponder for a second, and then I'll continue the video. Okay, let me continue going through why this margin top and margin bottom works. Because we have a flex grow element in here, what has to happen is we know the height of this is 1080, and then we go through and we get the height of each of the children to figure out how much available space is left in here, which includes taking into effect margin bottom and margin top. So then this thing is figured out like the height of this needs to be 600, and then it figures out all these other elements and then places them accordingly, which is why this margin bottom is working and moving this up from the bottom. So I think this is a clever solution for doing this. I really like this idea of using this. Now, one thing you'll have to do is if these things can have focus, there are additional properties that we can do, which is just say skip focus on here. So we add a skip focus attribute. And then when the column has focus and you're pressing up and down, it'll focus this, it'll skip this, and then focus this and this element. So I actually think this is a really good solution for this problem. The alternative way is, let's say you want this kind of layout and we get rid of this box. So now all three elements are the same, but we really want this one to be at the top and these two to be at the bottom. And this is where you'd have to do, like, throw in another view element. And let me get the solution and then we'll just go through the video, which will make it a little simpler. Okay, so here is the alternative version, or another way of doing that same thing, which is we've nested a column inside of a column. So you can have a column which will handle setting focus on this, and then it will set focus on this column, which is now at the bottom. Now, some important things that I've done is I set this to flex item equals false, which means when this does its flex calculations, it's not going to set a y value onto this column. So it will keep its same y value. It won't change because it's not a flex item. And then I'm saying justify content flex end so that this column is putting these boxes on the bottom of the screen. And it should be doing it in the same order. Actually, I think this is an interesting question of, is this box at the bottom or not? So you might have to reverse order on doing this, or what you can do, actually, it seems like it's doing that. Or you can do flex order, which you can set, I want this one to be first, I want this one to be second. Like you can define which order they go in. That will be easier to see if we actually set like text on here. But I'm gonna go through that in this video. But here's another way of doing it. I did have the set flex boundary equals fixed. So one the thing that this does is Flex tries to be smart and update the parent containers width or height depending on the size of the elements. So I'm a little confused. I'm going to research this afterwards. But if you don't do this, like you'll see the container becomes the height of the first column because it thinks like, hey, I've calculated the height of you and you're only equal to the height of this one box. So I'm just going to update the height of myself to match that. So if you don't want that to happen, just set flex boundary equal to fixed, which keeps it whatever the original size is. So hopefully this was a video that just kind of explains some of the intricacies and gets rid of some of the confusion of when you use Y, when you use margin top. As always, please give me more comments, more examples that you want me to walk through of what's happening, and happy to explain this stuff. All right, thanks.